In the bleak expanse of World War II, where every day felt like a fight for survival and every shadow could conceal the cold hand of death, there was a small village caught in the relentless grasp of German occupation. The people of this village had learned to live under the heavy weight of fear, where every moment was tainted by the presence of soldiers, their boots marching relentlessly through the streets. The children, once innocent and free, had their lives turned upside down as the war encroached on every aspect of their existence. What was once a world of playful laughter and bright skies had transformed into something dark and unrecognizable. For these children, the world had become a place where even the simplest things, like the sound of their mother's voice or the warmth of the sun, held the ominous weight of uncertainty. They had learned, through quiet observation and whispered warnings from their parents, that the soldiers were not just armed with weapons, but with the power to take everything away. They understood that anything could happen at any moment, that even their small hands, so accustomed to holding toys and books, could be used for a purpose far darker than they ever imagined. The village had become a place where the streets seemed quieter than before. The once bustling marketplace now stood silent, the stalls abandoned and only the occasional movement of a soldier or a nervous civilian breaking the stillness. The air was thick with the palpable tension of occupation, and no one dared to question it. Every household, once a sanctuary, now seemed like a prison, its walls echoing with the muffled sounds of those who could no longer bear to raise their voices. The war had stolen the world from the children, forcing them to grow up too quickly, their carefree days now memories of a distant past. It was on one such day, a day that felt like every other under the heavy grip of occupation, that the fear in the village grew sharper. The children had been called to the school, but they did not know why. There was an air of uncertainty as they walked in clusters down the narrow roads, their hearts pounding in their chests. The adults watched them with an unease they could not disguise, their eyes filled with an unspoken worry. The children, unaware of the exact gravity of the situation, clung to each other, their minds too innocent to fully comprehend the horror that was about to unfold. As the group of children arrived at the school gates, the atmosphere shifted, becoming suffocating in its intensity. The gates themselves seemed to loom over them, dark and unyielding, like a barrier between them and whatever was to come. The soldiers, who had been standing in formation near the entrance, turned their eyes toward the children as they approached, their faces cold and unreadable. The children's steps faltered, the weight of the soldiers' gazes pressing down on them like a physical force. They could feel the tension building in the air, a fear that was no longer abstract but palpable, like the buzzing of static before a storm. The soldiers had no need for words. Their presence alone was enough to instill terror. The children's eyes darted from one soldier to another, searching for something, anything, that might offer them a shred of reassurance. But there was none. The soldiers stood like stone statues, their bodies rigid, their hands on the butts of their rifles. They had a silent authority that commanded fear, a power that felt unnatural, like something that could not be resisted. Some of the children, too frightened to speak, held tightly to the hands of their friends or siblings, their small fingers trembling in fear. Others stood in complete silence, their minds racing, their hearts heavy with the uncertainty of what was about to happen. The air was thick with a sense of inevitability, as if the events of the day were already written, as if there was no escape from the fate that loomed over them. The school building, which had once been a place of learning and safety, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in on the children as they stood frozen at the gates. The windows of the school, once filled with the laughter of children playing and the sound of lessons being taught, now seemed dark and foreboding. The building, like everything else in the village, had been swallowed by the war. Its purpose had shifted from being a sanctuary of knowledge to a place of fear, a place where the children would face the unknown. And then, as the children stood there, their faces pale with terror, they heard the heavy footsteps of approaching soldiers. It wasn't just a few of them this time, there was a whole unit, marching in perfect formation. The rhythmic sound of their boots hitting the ground created a sense of dread, like the countdown to an inevitable tragedy. The children could feel the tension rising, their breaths shallow as their bodies tensed in anticipation. They were trapped in this moment, unable to move, unable to escape the fear that had gripped them. They didn't know what was coming, but they knew it would not be good. There was no comfort to be found in the gaze of the soldiers. Their eyes were unfeeling, as if the children were nothing more than shadows in the midst of a storm. The children's thoughts swirled in confusion and dread. Had they done something wrong? Had they crossed some invisible line? The question gnawed at them, but there was no answer. No one spoke, for fear that any sound would bring the wrath of the soldiers down upon them. As the line of soldiers approached, the children instinctively took a step back, their tiny bodies shrinking from the threat that loomed before them. Their hearts raced, their thoughts were scattered, and their bodies ached with the strain of standing still. The oppressive atmosphere was suffocating, each passing second feeling like an eternity. They could hear the soldiers' voices, low and commanding, but the words made no sense to them. They could not understand the language, but they understood the tone, the coldness, the cruelty, the threat of violence that hovered over them like a dark cloud. The children had learned to fear the sounds of this language, for it was a language that spoke of control, of oppression, of domination. It was the language of war, and it held no mercy. The soldiers' eyes flicked over the children, inspecting them as if they were mere objects to be catalogued. Their hands tightened on their rifles, their bodies poised for action. The tension was unbearable, a pressure that seemed to crush everything in its path. For a moment, it felt as though the world had stopped moving, as though everything had frozen in time. The children stood there, their hearts pounding, their minds filled with a cold certainty that whatever happened next would change their lives forever. In that moment, the school gates no longer just symbolized an entrance to a place of learning. They had become a threshold to something far darker, something that the children had no way of understanding. The world outside had ceased to be a place of childhood wonder. It was now a place of violence and fear, where every step could be the last, where every day could bring something new and terrifying. All the children could do now was wait. Wait in silence. Wait for the unknown to unfold. But in their hearts, they all knew the same thing. Something terrible was about to happen. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, crooked shadows across the village as the children stood in silence at the gates of the school. The world around them had taken on a strange, almost dreamlike quality, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. The distant murmur of soldiers' voices reached their ears, but the sound seemed muffled, like the thrum of a faraway storm. The air was thick with fear and anticipation, and for the children, the whole world seemed to have shrunk to the few feet of ground they occupied. It was as though the sky had darkened above them, and the gates, once an innocuous part of their daily lives, had become the entryway to something far more sinister. The school grounds, once a place of laughter and learning, now seemed alien. The towering walls of the building loomed above them, cold and indifferent, their windows shut tight as if even the structure itself was holding its breath. The children, their hands clutching at each other for comfort, could sense that the familiar world they had known as children was no more. The world had shifted beneath their feet, and they now found themselves suspended in a moment of unshakable uncertainty, trapped in the liminal space between innocence and the harsh reality of war. The soldiers, once distant figures on the periphery of the children's world, now stood directly before them. Their uniforms, dark and imposing, seemed to swallow up the sunlight, casting an even darker shadow on the children's already fragile hearts. The soldiers' eyes were cold and empty, their faces unreadable masks of discipline and power. It was as if they were not people at all, but rather instruments of the war, moving without emotion or thought. The children could see the rifles slung across their backs, the metallic gleam of weapons that promised pain and suffering. But more than that, it was the soldiers' gaze that held them captive, a gaze that seemed to penetrate into the very core of their beings. The children, wide-eyed and trembling, could not escape the oppressive weight of it. They stood frozen, as if the soldiers' eyes alone were enough to paralyze them. There was no verbal command to move, no shouted orders, but the children instinctively knew what was expected of them. They were herded, nudged forward by the soldiers' unspoken will, pushed into an orderly line as they shuffled toward the school entrance. Their steps were hesitant, their bodies stiff with fear, as though every movement was being watched, judged, and condemned. The air around them grew colder with every step they took, and their feet felt heavy, as though they were wading through a fog of dread that clung to their every motion. The soldiers' presence seemed to stretch out endlessly, their bodies creating a wall of rigid authority between the children and the rest of the world. The children could no longer see the streets they had walked down moments earlier, the once familiar landmarks now obscured by the implacable march of military power. The faces of their friends and siblings, once a source of comfort, had become masked in confusion and fear. Each child's eyes flitted nervously from one soldier to the next, searching for some sign of mercy or compassion, but finding none. There was only silence, the oppressive silence of a moment about to change everything. The sound of boots striking the ground, sharp and rhythmic, filled the air, drowning out all other noises. It was a sound that became synonymous with the soldiers themselves, a sound that meant authority, control, and, above all, the expectation of compliance. It was a sound that heralded the arrival of something far more ominous than the children could fully grasp. They stood there, like little statues, unable to look away from the soldiers, unable to look for help anywhere outside the circle of fear that had enveloped them. It felt as though the world had closed in on them, trapping them in a cage made not of iron bars, but of sheer, overwhelming terror. Their breaths quickened, and some of the children, unable to contain their growing anxiety, began to sob quietly, their tears running down their cheeks in rivulets. The sound of their soft crying seemed out of place in this new world, as though it did not belong to a place where soldiers marched, where violence hovered in the air like a dark cloud. Yet, despite their terror, the children remained motionless, their fear giving them no escape, no way to flee from the nightmare that had descended upon them. The soldiers, for all their power, made no move to comfort the children. They did not speak a word of reassurance, nor did they offer any sign that this would not be as bad as the children feared. Their faces remained as impassive as ever, their eyes distant and unwavering. The children could not understand why they were there, why they were being treated like this, but it didn't matter. The sense of powerlessness was suffocating. They were just children, and the world they had once known had been ripped away from them. There was no mercy here, only the cold, unyielding force of an occupying army. As they reached the gates of the school, the children could see the looming shadows of the building, its dark windows like empty eyes watching them, judging them, waiting for them. The gates themselves seemed like a mouth, ready to swallow them whole. The air grew heavier with each step, as though the very earth itself was pressing down on their shoulders. The sound of their footsteps, which had once been light and carefree, now echoed with a hollow, dreadful finality. There was no going back, no place of refuge. The children had reached the point of no return. The gates creaked open slowly, their rusty hinges groaning under the weight of years of disuse. Beyond them lay the schoolyard, but the children could not bring themselves to look at it. They knew what it was, a place that had once been filled with laughter, with the sound of children playing and shouting, with the simple joys of learning and growing. But now, in the aftermath of the war, the schoolyard felt cold and desolate, like a forgotten place lost in time. The children could feel the weight of history pressing down on them, as if they were standing at the intersection of a past they had not lived and a future they could not see. As the children entered the school grounds, their small bodies were pushed forward by the soldiers, who remained eerily silent. The tension between them and the children was palpable, thick as fog. The soldiers had no need to speak, for their presence alone was enough to assert their dominance. The children understood that silence was their only refuge, the only way to avoid drawing attention, to avoid drawing the ire of the soldiers. But their silence was not a form of submission, it was a desperate attempt to hold on to whatever shred of control they could. For a brief moment, the world outside the school gates, the village, the streets, the air, felt like a distant memory, something that belonged to another life, another time. The children were no longer part of the world they had known. They were no longer the carefree children who had run through the streets with their friends, who had laughed and played without fear. They had crossed into a new world, one defined by fear, uncertainty, and the heavy, unrelenting weight of occupation. The silence that enveloped the schoolyard now was not the quiet of peace, but the silence of an impending storm. The children stood there, helpless and afraid, but they did not speak. They did not move. They only waited for the next step, the next move, the next moment of their lives to unfold. They stood on the threshold of something terrible, and though they could not know it yet, their lives would never be the same again. In the distance, the sound of marching feet grew louder, breaking the silence that had settled like a thick fog over the scene. The children, their minds still reeling from the tense moments before, shifted uneasily under the weight of the soldiers' gaze. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. The air was thick with the pungent scent of fear, a smell so sharp it seemed to cut through the quiet. The children, their hearts still racing, stood in place as if tethered to the ground by an invisible force. Each breath was a struggle, each beat of their hearts a reminder of the oppressive weight bearing down on them. They had been so sure of their world just hours ago, of the simple routines that made up their days. School had been a place of normality, of safety, where they could laugh and play with their friends, where the most pressing worry was whether they would finish their homework in time for the next lesson. But now, the same school, the same grounds, had transformed into something unrecognizable. It was no longer a place of refuge, but a space where the shadow of terror stretched long, swallowing everything it touched. The soldiers had created a physical barrier between the children and their world, standing tall and unyielding like statues of stone. Each soldier seemed to be a part of that wall, their faces as cold and unreadable as the iron weapons they carried. And yet, despite the soldiers' imposing presence, it was the knowledge that something far greater than any individual threat loomed over them that filled the children with the deepest sense of dread. They had heard whispers in their homes, from their parents and from older siblings, of the cruelty of war, of the ways that people could be stripped of their humanity when caught in the grinding gears of conflict. And now, they were at the mercy of that same merciless force, at the mercy of soldiers who had been trained to carry out orders without question, without hesitation, without compassion. The children shifted again, eyes flicking nervously to one another. They exchanged fleeting looks of confusion and fear, unsure of what was expected of them, unsure of what would happen next. There was no comforting voice telling them that it would be all right. No hand reaching out to guide them, to protect them from the unknown. They were utterly alone in this moment, abandoned by the world they had once known. The world outside the gates of the school seemed a distant memory, as though they had been transported to some other place, some other time where nothing made sense anymore. Their lives had become the stuff of nightmares, things they had only heard of in stories, stories of cruelty and fear, of suffering and survival. But here, now, it was no longer just a story, it was their reality. The distant sound of boots marching grew louder still, a rhythmic, methodical pattern that reverberated through the air. It was the sound of authority, of a system built on fear, moving inexorably forward. The children's hearts skipped a beat, their bodies trembling with the anticipation of what was to come. Then, just as the sound seemed to reach its peak, there was a sudden shift. The marching had stopped, but it was not the silence that followed that caused the children to take notice. It was the arrival of someone new. A figure, standing apart from the others, emerged from the shadows, moving with purpose toward the gates. At first, the children could not tell who this new person was. His figure was cloaked in the same uniform as the soldiers around them, but there was something different about him. His posture, his movements, they held a quiet authority that was not like the soldiers who had surrounded them. Where the soldiers stood like mechanical sentinels, stiff and unmoving, this figure seemed to possess a certain fluidity, a calm energy that was distinctly human. As he approached, the children felt the slightest shift in the atmosphere, as if the air itself had grown heavier, pregnant with some unspoken change. And then, as he drew closer, the children could see his face, a face marked by experience, by the hardships of war, but also by something else, resolve. It was an expression that seemed to exude quiet confidence, and yet there was no arrogance to it, no trace of superiority. The officer's gaze, direct and unwavering, scanned the group of children, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though he was looking straight through them, as if searching for something deeper. His eyes briefly met those of the soldiers who had been standing guard, and for a split second, a silent understanding passed between them. The children could not comprehend the exchange, but they could sense that something was happening, something important, something that had the potential to change everything. The soldiers, who had been so sure of their role in the moment before, now seemed hesitant. The rigid line they had formed, so impervious to any disturbance, now appeared to waver under the weight of this new presence. The officer's mere arrival had unsettled the atmosphere, causing ripples in the tension that had previously been so thick it was almost tangible. But it wasn't just the soldiers who were affected. The children, too, felt the change. A subtle shift in the air, a flicker of hope that they hadn't allowed themselves to feel until now, seemed to sweep over them. The officer did not speak immediately. He stood at the gates, taking in the scene before him. His gaze, though stern, was not filled with malice. Instead, it seemed to reflect a certain understanding, as though he knew exactly what this moment meant for the children. And yet he said nothing. He did not offer comfort, nor did he make any grand gestures. His silence was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of someone who was carefully weighing the situation, considering his next move with the utmost gravity. For the children, every second felt like an eternity. They had no way of knowing who this man was, what role he played in the grand scheme of things. They did not know if he was a friend, an enemy, or something in between. His uniform marked him as a soldier, but there was something in the way he moved, in the way he carried himself, that suggested he was different from the others. The soldiers around them were faceless, their presence oppressive and terrifying. But this officer, this stranger, seemed to possess a certain humanity that was absent in the others. As he stepped forward, closer to the group of children, his eyes remained calm, focused on them without judgment. It was as though he understood something that the children themselves had yet to grasp, that, in this moment, their lives had taken a sudden and unpredictable turn. The officer's role in this moment was still unclear, but one thing was certain: his presence was changing the dynamic in ways that none of them could have anticipated. The soldiers, who had been poised for action, now seemed to hesitate, their movements slowing, their bodies stiffening as they exchanged uncertain glances. The children, too, felt the change. They stood a little straighter now, their fearful eyes fixed on the officer, who was still close enough for them to see the faint traces of weariness in his face, the subtle lines of age and experience that marked him as someone who had seen much in his time. His gaze, though steady, was not without compassion. The children, despite the terror that still gripped them, could sense something in the officer that they had not felt from the soldiers. It was as if he was a different kind of presence entirely, one that did not belong to the world of this war, one that had not yet been consumed by the chaos and cruelty around them. The moment was suspended in time, and the children stood in the eye of the storm, uncertain of what would come next. The tension hung in the air like a heavy fog, thick and impenetrable, as the officer stood before the children, his presence a sharp contrast to the rigid, unyielding soldiers that surrounded them. His eyes, though focused and calculating, seemed to soften ever so slightly as they swept over the young faces before him. His gaze lingered a moment longer on their trembling hands, their wide, fearful eyes, their bodies frozen in place as though awaiting the inevitable. There was an undeniable recognition in his expression, a silent acknowledgement of the fear that gripped the children, and a deeper, more intimate understanding of what that fear meant. To him, these were not just children caught in the path of war, they were lives, stories that had yet to be written, potential that had not yet been realized, and he had no intention of allowing them to be lost to the horrors of the conflict that had already taken so much. The officer took a step forward, the echo of his boots on the ground resounding in the otherwise quiet courtyard. It was a simple movement, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. The soldiers, still standing in their rigid formation, shifted uneasily under his gaze, as if caught in a moment of uncertainty. They had been trained to follow orders without question, to execute their duties with precision and without hesitation. But now, in the presence of this man, there was an undeniable sense of hesitation, an air of disquiet that seemed to ripple through their ranks. For a brief moment, they were no longer soldiers carrying out the will of a distant command. They were human beings, caught in a situation that seemed to defy the logic they had been trained to uphold. The officer's movements were slow, deliberate, measured. His presence was imposing without being overtly aggressive. He was not here to threaten or intimidate, yet there was a quiet power in the way he stood, unflinching, despite the uncertainty that surrounded him. His uniform, though battle-worn, was still immaculate, every crease and fold in place. His demeanor suggested a man who had seen far too much of the brutality of war, a man who understood the value of life not in the abstract but in the tangible, personal way that only those who had lived through its ravages could. He was not the enemy the children feared, he was something else, something different. But what he was, they could not yet understand. As the officer came closer to the children, their fear began to shift, though ever so slightly. The soldier's harsh, unfeeling presence had enveloped them, suffocating them with an unspoken promise of violence and punishment. But the officer, with his calm, controlled movements, seemed to offer them something else, a glimpse of something other than the relentless force that had governed their lives for so long. The children, still on edge, found themselves unable to look away from him. His gaze, steady and unflinching, met theirs, and for a brief, fleeting moment, it was as if the world had narrowed to this single point in time. The officer stopped a few paces away, his presence towering over them, but he did not make a move to approach any further. His posture was firm but not threatening, his face composed but not unfeeling. There was something in the stillness of his stance that seemed to reassure the children, though they could not yet name what it was. It was not kindness, not in the traditional sense of the word, but something deeper, a sense of respect, perhaps, or a recognition of their humanity that none of the soldiers had shown. The officer's mere existence in this moment seemed to challenge everything the children had come to expect of the war, of the people who wielded power over their lives. And though they could not yet place it, the presence of this man began to shift the balance of fear that had held them captive since they first stepped through the school gates. There was a silence that stretched between them, thick with anticipation, with the weight of unknown consequences hanging in the air. The children, unable to escape the pressure of the moment, stood frozen, still uncertain of what was to come. And then, just as the silence became almost unbearable, the officer did something that none of the children could have expected. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, his fingers moving with practiced ease, and pulled out a small packet of candy. The simplicity of the gesture seemed almost absurd in this environment, where violence and cruelty were the language of the day, where every encounter with authority had been shaped by harshness and punishment. Yet there it was, a small, fragile offering, held out before them like a lifeline. The officer's hand, steady and unwavering, extended the packet of candy toward the children. The small, brightly wrapped packages seemed to shimmer in the dim light, their colorful foil a stark contrast to the gray, oppressive atmosphere that had gripped the courtyard. The children, still paralyzed by fear, hesitated. They could not fathom the meaning behind this gesture. Was it a trick? A cruel game? Or was it, in fact, something more, an attempt to offer them a semblance of normalcy, of humanity, in a world that had stripped them of both? For a moment, no one moved. The soldiers remained rooted in place, their expressions unreadable, though there was a subtle shift in the air as they, too, observed the officer's actions. Some of them glanced at one another, their faces betraying the smallest flicker of confusion. What was the meaning of this moment? What was the officer trying to convey? Was it a sign of weakness? Or something else entirely? The children, still unsure of how to respond, exchanged uncertain glances, their eyes wide with disbelief. They could not bring themselves to reach for the candy. Their hands remained clenched at their sides, their bodies stiff with fear. They had been trained to fear authority, to fear the soldiers who had so often represented the harsh, unforgiving nature of the war that consumed their lives. Yet, in the officer's outstretched hand, they saw something different, something that had been buried beneath layers of fear and violence. They saw a sign, not of kindness perhaps, but of recognition, a recognition that they were not mere objects to be controlled, but children, human beings with feelings and hopes, trapped in a world they had never chosen. And then, slowly, tentatively, one child, just one, took a small step forward. It was a subtle movement, but it was enough to break the stillness, to shift the atmosphere ever so slightly. The child's hand trembled as it reached for the candy, the small packet feeling almost absurdly large in their tiny fingers. The others watched, wide-eyed and motionless, as the child accepted the offering. It was a small act, seemingly insignificant, but it carried with it a weight that none of them could fully comprehend. For in that simple gesture, in the act of accepting something so ordinary in the midst of such extraordinary fear, the children felt a flicker of something they had not allowed themselves to feel for a long time: hope. The officer did not smile, nor did he show any outward sign of satisfaction. His expression remained unchanged, calm, controlled, as though he had simply done what he believed was necessary, as though this act of generosity, in its simplicity, held a greater meaning that went beyond mere kindness. It was not about the candy itself, it was about what it represented. The officer, in that moment, had offered the children a connection to something greater than the war that had consumed them. He had offered them a reminder that, even in the darkest of times, there were still small moments of humanity, still glimpses of light in the midst of overwhelming darkness. The children, still unsure of what had just transpired, took a collective breath, their hearts beating a little more steadily than before. The officer's gesture, though small and seemingly inconsequential, had shifted something in the air, something deep inside them. For the first time since they had been brought to the gates, they felt as though they had not been abandoned by the world. They had been seen, if only for a moment, not as victims or as objects, but as children with the same needs, the same desires, the same fears as any other child in a world that seemed to have forgotten them. The moment, though brief, held a weight that none of them could easily forget. In that single act of quiet defiance against the crushing force of the war, something had been altered, something that could not be undone, no matter what happened next. The silence that followed the officer's small but significant gesture hung heavy in the air, a strange, almost uncomfortable stillness that settled over the children like a blanket. They had been so consumed by fear, by the overwhelming sense of helplessness that the presence of the soldiers and the looming threats had cast over them. But now, as the packet of candy passed from the officer's hand to that of the child who dared to step forward, something shifted. The world around them, which had felt so cold and unyielding, seemed to pause for just a moment, giving the children a space to breathe, a space where the weight of fear didn't quite feel so suffocating. It wasn't as if the war had ended, or that the horrors of the occupation had suddenly ceased to exist. But in that small exchange, the officer had given them something they hadn't known they needed: a fleeting moment of humanity, a glimpse of something beyond the violence and cruelty that had defined their lives for so long. The child who had taken the candy stood still, holding the small packet in their trembling hands as though unsure of what to do next. The others, still frozen in place, looked on in stunned silence, unsure if they were supposed to follow this act of courage, or if it had been a mistake. It was hard for them to process what had just happened. The officer, a figure of calm authority, had not struck them down for moving, for daring to take something from him. Instead, he had simply stood there, watching, his expression unreadable but not unkind. It was a gesture so simple yet so profound that it seemed to unsettle everything the children had learned about power, about fear, about the roles they were expected to play in this brutal, unforgiving world. For a long moment, nothing else changed. The soldiers around them remained as they were, unmoving, their faces blank masks of indifference. Their eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of uncertainty as they watched the interaction unfold before them. This officer, this figure who had appeared so unexpectedly, was not behaving in the way they had been trained to expect. He was not imposing his will through force, nor was he showing the typical dominance that the children had become so accustomed to. There was no harsh reprimand, no angry order. There was only the officer's stillness, his quiet strength, and the candy that now rested in the hands of a child who, despite everything, had reached out and taken it. The air was thick with tension, but this time it was a different kind of tension. It was not the crushing, suffocating fear that had ruled the children's lives since the beginning of the war, but a subtle kind of anticipation, an unspoken question that hung between them all. What would happen now? The soldiers had been waiting for a signal, for some command to act, but the officer's silence was a signal of its own. He was not going to give orders, not in the way the children expected, not in the way they feared. Instead, he seemed to be waiting for something else, something deeper than simple obedience or submission. He seemed to be waiting for them to respond, not just as soldiers or victims, but as human beings, as children who still had something inside them that could not be erased by the war. One by one, the children began to move, hesitantly at first, as though testing the waters, unsure whether the moment they were in was real or merely an illusion, a trick of the mind. The child who had taken the candy held it out to the others, a quiet invitation that seemed to carry with it a kind of courage. Slowly, another child stepped forward, their hands shaking slightly as they accepted the offer. Then another and another, until, one by one, the children had taken a piece of candy. It was a simple act, yet it felt as if the entire weight of the world had shifted, even if only for a moment. It was as though the candy itself held more than just sweetness. It held a promise, a fragile hope that things might one day be different, that there might be something left to fight for beyond mere survival.